branches. I stumble on a root and launch into a massive spider web. That's when I notice the ungodly abundance of spiders in this forest, orb weavers, I think, that spin elaborate radial webs, which glimmer gold in spears of sunlight. Here in the dim wattage, I can barely see them, but it seems that every gap between the trees is latticed with their webbing, and in the center of each web lurks a sizable spider, still and vigilant. What flashes through my mind is that Far Side cartoon showing two spiders perched in a giant web as a fat little boy walks toward it. One spider says to the other, "If we pull this off, we'll eat like kings." Then, up in a tree just off to my right, I hear the Kwaya-Twaya, a begging call used by young New Caledonian crows with their parents. All I can make out is a stirring of leaves. Who knows, maybe 007 is up there, feeding his young with grubs he has gathered with a hook tool. Does the DNA he has passed on to his offspring explain why his kind, of all birds on the planet, makes such elaborate tools? Are his genes as a hook toolmaker different from Blue's? The New Caledonian Crow dossier is still packed with unanswered questions. Which came first, the crow's remarkable tool use or its exceptional intelligence? Toolmaking, or the beak shape and vision so neatly adapted to its requirements? DNA for problem solving, or tricky environmental challenges that shape genes? These are the kinds of mysterious biological questions that I find shearing, untidy, unresolved, still in process. As darkness falls, it's pleasing to contemplate the mystery. Somehow, time in its stew has mixed island and bird, and slowly, incrementally, over the long pull of evolution, come up with this mind-blowing maker of tools. Talk about genius. Twitter. Social savvy. We rub and polish our brains by contact with those of others. Michel de Montaigne. Many bird species are highly social. They breed in colonies, bathe in groups, roost in congregations, forage in flocks. They eavesdrop. They argue. They cheat. They deceive and manipulate. They kidnap. They divorce. They display a strong sense of fairness. They give gifts. They play keep away and tug-of-war with twigs, strands of Spanish moss, bits of gauze. They pilfer from their neighbors. They warn their young away from strangers. They tease. They share. They cultivate social networks. They vie for status. They kiss to console one another. They teach their young. They blackmail their parents. They summon witnesses to the death of a peer. They may even grieve. Not long ago, this kind of social savoir-faire was presumed far beyond a bird's reach. The idea, for instance, that birds could think about what other birds might be thinking was considered preposterous. Lately, the view has shifted, with science suggesting that some bird species have social lives nearly as complex as our own, which require some very sophisticated mental skills indeed. The world's thousands of bird species display a dazzling array of social organizations. Some, such as the belted kingfisher and the scissor-tailed flycatcher, are solitary and ferociously territorial, hanging out only in mated pairs. Others are born for group company, rooks, for instance, supremely social Old World members of the crow family that nest in crowded rookeries from the United Kingdom to Japan, or king eiders. Large ducks of Arctic coastal waters that love to mingle and gather in prodigious collective flocks of up to 10,000. Great tits, the colorful little yellow-breasted birds widespread across Eurasia, have an intriguing social organization that gives new meaning to the old adage, birds of a feather. Researchers from Oxford University recently constructed a kind of Facebook for the tits, an association matrix, revealing the pattern of associations among individuals in a population of 1,000 great tits in Wytham Woods, a stretch of well-studied old woodlands to the west of Oxford. The study revealed just who affiliates with whom and which birds regularly forage at the same place together. The tits, it turns out, have a complicated social network in which birds gather in loose foraging flocks based on their personalities. Even chickens form complex social relationships. Within a few days of socializing, chickens establish a stable social group with a clear hierarchy. In fact, we owe the expression, pecking order, to studies of the social relations among chickens by the Norwegian zoologist Thorleif Skjelderup Eby, who found that pecking orders are ladder-like, with the top rung conferring great privilege in the form of food and safety, and the bottom rung fraught with vulnerability and risk. Has all of this living cheek by jowl with mates, family, friends, and peers made birds smart? Do they owe their quick, flexible minds not just to the tricky physical challenges of their environment but to the sticky social ones, the trials and tribulations of getting along? It's called the social intelligence hypothesis, and among scientists, it has lately won a considerable following. The idea that a demanding social life might drive the evolution of brainpower was developed by Nicholas Humphrey, a psychologist at the London School of Economics, in 1976. Humphrey was pondering the monkeys housed in groups of 8 or 9 in his laboratory. The monkeys lived in austere wire mesh cages, and he worried about whether the impoverished environment would affect the cognitive functioning of the young ones. There were no objects, no toys, no environmental stimuli of any kind, and there was no need to avoid predators or search for food. So it seemed to Humphrey that there were no problems to solve. In the face of this, he was puzzled by the monkeys' sharp intellect and their ability to perform impressive cognitive feats, despite living day to day in a barren, stultifying environment. All they had was one another. And then one day I looked again, Humphrey writes, and saw a half-weaned infant pestering its mother, 2 adolescents engaged in a mock battle, an old male grooming a female whilst another female tried to sidle up to him, and I suddenly saw the scene with new eyes. Forget about the absence of objects, these monkeys had each other to manipulate and to explore. There could be no risk of their dying an intellectual death when the social environment provided such obvious opportunity for participating in a running dialectical debate. The rich social milieu came close to resembling a simian school of Athens, wrote Humphrey, and required unique cognitive skills and social calculations. The monkeys had to gauge the consequences of their own behavior within the group. They had to size up one another. They had to try to guess the likely behavior of their peers, track others' social relationships, dominance, rank, and competitive ability, and weigh advantage and loss in their interactions. All of these calculations were ephemeral, ambiguous, and liable to change, requiring constant reevaluation. It was a game of social plot and counterplot that promoted intellectual faculties of the highest order, argued Humphrey. To interact effectively, social animals had to become natural psychologists. Now scientists believe that many bird species are not so different. Those that live in social groups have to sort out social contacts, smooth ruffled feathers, and avoid squabbles. They have to monitor the behavior of others to make decisions about whether to cooperate or compete, whom to communicate with, whom to learn from. They have to recognize numerous individuals, keep track of them, recall what this or that confederate did the last time, and predict what he or she will do now. Because many species of birds share the same kinds of social challenges that may have fueled intelligence in primates, their brains, like ours, may be designed to manage relationships. A range of bird species show impressive social smarts. Magpies recognize their own image in a mirror, a form of self-awareness that we once believed was restricted to humans and a handful of other sophisticated social mammals. When experimenters placed a red dot on the throat of 6 magpies, 2 of them tried to scratch off the dot on their own bodies with their legs, rather than reacting to the image in the mirror. African gray parrots are remarkable collaborators. In the wild, these birds roost in flocks of thousands, forage in groups of 30 or so, and form lifelong bonds with a mate. They're rarely alone, unless they're in captivity. In the lab, they'll pair up to solve physical puzzles, pulling a string together to open a food box. They also understand the benefits of reciprocity and sharing and will opt for a food reward that will be shared with a human rather than one enjoyed solo, as long as they know their human friend will also reciprocate. Reciprocity in the form of gift-giving is another kind of social behavior unusual in non-humans, but fairly common among certain birds, including crows. 2 decades ago, when a family friend first reported receiving gifts from the crows she regularly fed, a marble, a little wooden bead, a bottle cap, colored berries, all left on her doorstep, I was skeptical. But in recent years, tales have rolled in from all over the country of crows offering up gifts of jewelry, hardware, Shards of glass, a Santa figurine, a foam dart from a toy gun, a Donald Duck Pez dispenser, even a candy heart with a love printed on it, delivered just after Valentine's Day. In 2015, a story surfaced in Seattle of an 8-year-old girl, Gabby Mann, who started feeding crows on her way to and from the bus stop when she was only 4. Later she began offering the crows peanuts on a tray in her yard as part of a daily ritual, and from time to time, after the peanuts had been consumed, trinkets showed up on the tray: an earring, bolts and screws, hinges, buttons, a tiny white plastic tube, a rotting crab claw, a small scrap of metal printed with the word best, and Gabby's favorite, an opalescent white heart. The less icky objects Gabby has collected in plastic bags labeled with the dates they were received. Leaving gifts suggests that crows understand the benefit of reciprocating past acts that have benefited them and also that they anticipate future reward, write biologist John Marsloff and his co-author Tony Angel in their book Gifts of the Crow. It is a planned activity. The crow has to plan to bring the gift and plan to leave the gift. Crows and ravens will balk at doing work for less reward than a peer is getting. This sensitivity to inequity had previously been thought to exist only in primates and dogs and is considered a crucial cognitive tool in the evolution of human cooperation. Corvids and cockatoos can delay gratification if they think a reward is worth waiting for, a form of emotional intelligence involving self-control, persistence, and the ability to motivate oneself. Young children who can stave off eating one marshmallow now in favor of 2 later have nothing over these winged marvels of willpower. Alice Auersperg and her team at the University of Vienna found that Goffin's cockatoos offered a pecan would wait up to 80 seconds for a more delicious treat of a cashew. The cockatoos held the reward in their beaks directly against their taste organs during the entire delay, says Auersperg. This requires some very impressive self-control. Crows will wait up to several minutes for a better treat. However, if the delay is more than a few seconds long, they'll place the first reward out of sight while they're waiting. They do this because they're food cachers, and that's an important part of their ecology, explains Auersperg. Deciding to delay gratification requires not only self-control but also the capacity to assess a respective gain in the quality of a reward relative to the cost of waiting for it, not to mention the reliability of the individual doling out the rewards. These kinds of abilities, thought to be the precursors of economic decision-making, are rare in non-humans. Ravens have a remarkable ability to remember relationships. Young ravens belong to so-called fission fusion societies. Before they settle down to a paired, territorial life, they hang out in social groups, where they form valuable alliances with friends and family members. They pick special individuals to share food with, to sit close to preen with and play with. But unlike stable chicken flocks, the social groupings of ravens shift, break apart, and come back together over seasons and years. So the birds face the challenge of keeping track of individuals that are coming and going. Do they recall their affiliations after long periods of separation? Thomas Bugmere, a cognitive biologist at the University of Vienna, recently sought to answer this question in a study of a social group of 16 young ravens in the Austrian Alps. As far as scientists knew, a bird's long-term social memory was limited to remembering neighbors from one breeding season to the next. But Bugmere found that ravens remember their valued friends even after a separation of as long as 3 years. It's worth noting that corvids recognize and recall not only fellow corvids but humans, too. They can pick out familiar human faces from a crowd, particularly those that represent a threat, and remember them for long periods of time. Just ask Bernd Heinrich, who has tried to conceal his identity from the ravens he works with by changing clothing, wearing kimonos, wigs, and sunglasses, and hopping or limping to shift his gait. Or John Marsloff, who describes walking across the campus of the University of Washington and being singled out from thousands of other people by American crows that recognize him as a dangerous person who has trapped and banded them. The disgruntled crows still remember him years later and harass and scold him whenever they spot him. In a brain imaging study on the crows, Marsloff recently discovered that the birds recognize human faces using the same visual and neural pathways that we do. Pinyon jays use impressive social reasoning to figure out where they fit in their flock's social order. Avid socialites of the crow family, these jays live in large permanent flocks with firm social hierarchies, like chickens. They depend on an understanding of third-party relationships to work out how to behave toward an unfamiliar jay, whether to be aggressive or submissive. Think of it this way: a strange jay enters your flock. It's clear that your flock mate Pete dominates over Sylvester. And you know that Henry dominates over Pete. Who is more dominant, Henry or Sylvester? Pinyon jays can infer the social status of a stranger by the way it behaves with other birds, thereby avoiding unnecessary conflict and possible injury. This ability to make judgments about relationships on the basis of indirect evidence is called transitive inference, and is considered an advanced social skill. I'm fond of jays, so brash, quarrelsome, jeering. The flocks of blue jays in my region are known for their close family bonds and complicated social systems, as well as their keen intelligence and sweet tooth for acorns. They have a way of exploding on the scene, shrieking at one another, chaffing, scoffing, scolding, barking like blue terriers, as Emily Dickinson said. Blue jays can select fertile acorns with 88% accuracy. They can also count to at least 5. And they can neatly mimic the piercing cry of a red-shouldered hawk, kia, kia, which they do often, perhaps to fool other birds into believing there's a raptor in the vicinity, leaving more nuts for the taking. No wonder blue jay is the trickster hero of the Chinook and other Northwest Coast tribes. One species of Old World jay displays especially endearing social acumen. A colorful member of the intelligent crow family, the male Eurasian jay appears to intuit his mate's state of mind, or at least her appetite, and responds by giving her what she most desires. The jay's Latin name, Garrulus glandarius, would seem to explain everything. Eurasian jays are chatty. But they're actually not as gregarious as their more communal cousins, rooks and jackdaws, which nest in crowded rookeries. Pair bonding is their thing. Like many other corvids, Eurasian jays share food, but they do so only to win the favor of their mates. A male courts a mate by selecting tasty gifts for her. Ljerka Ostoich and her colleagues at the University of Cambridge recently used this specialized form of gift-giving to probe whether these birds might be able to understand that other birds have their own needs and desires. A sophisticated social ability called state attribution. In an elegant experiment, male jays were allowed to watch through a screen while their mates ate their fill of one of 2 special treats, waxworms or mealworms. These goodies might not sound tasty to you, but waxworms are the dark. Birds, like people, favor variety and can fill up on too much of a good thing. It's called the specific satiety effect. A female jay's penchant shifts with her experience. It behooves a male to track these varying preferences, as giving his mate the food she most desires strengthens his bond with her. Sure enough, when a male jay was able to see his lady's choice in feasting in this trial, he chose to offer her the treat she hadn't been eating. But maybe he was just considering what might taste good himself. If watching her eat waxworm larvae diminishes his own appetite for that delicacy, this might govern his choice of what to offer her next. However, it turns out that watching her feed on one dish or the other has no effect on what he selects to eat himself. When there is no opportunity to feed his mate, he chooses between the 2 foods according to his own preferences. When he can share with her, he disengages from his personal desires and anticipates hers, as if he's cognizant of her specific satiety. He offers her the morsel of her choice with the same gentle courtesy a squire might in serving his lady a slice of her favorite chocolate cake. This may not be exactly like human state attribution, the ability to infer that others possess an internal life similar to, but different from, one's own. Still, it seems pretty close. The Eurasian jay demonstrates that he can understand his mate's specific desire state. He can understand that it differs from his own. And he can flexibly adjust his food-sharing behavior to suit her particular desires. These experiments provide exciting data that are in line with the notion that the male is attributing a desire to his female partner, says Ostoich. However, we need to conduct further studies to illuminate exactly what cues the males are using to respond to the female's specific satiety. We need to disentangle whether the male is responding purely to observable features of the female's behavior, or whether he can use those observable features to infer the female's desire. The possibility that a male jay may be able to intuit his mate's appetites by watching her hints at the possibility that birds may possess a key component of what's known as theory of mind, the understanding that others have beliefs, desires, and perspectives that are different from one's own. Attributing desires to others is cognitively less demanding than attributing beliefs, says Ostoich. For humans, this is an early step toward the development of a full theory of mind. If the male jay really understands what the female wants, this would provide evidence that a non-human animal is capable of this important aspect of theory of mind. Ask a dozen experts in the field of animal cognition whether non-human animals have theory of mind, and you'll get a dozen different answers. Generally, there are two camps. First, the self-described killjoys, who deny that non-human species have anything remotely resembling this kind of advanced cognition, and second, those who echo Darwin's claim that humans differ mentally from other species only in degree but not in kind. Two scientists at the University of Pennsylvania, Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney, lodge in the latter camp. They argue that even the most complex human forms of theory of mind have their roots in what they call a subconscious appreciation of others' intentions and perspectives. At the very least, the scrub jays appear to possess these building blocks of theory of mind. There are big payoffs to being social, more eyes to spot predators and locate food, and plenty of opportunities to learn from others. This means you don't have to waste time figuring out how to open a nut, or risk eating a poisonous berry. You can imitate good ideas and follow flock members to the richest, safest food sources. Rooks and ravens, for example, rely on other flock members to find fruitful foraging patches. According to Lucy Aplin, tits use their social connections to locate food and to copy strategies for getting it, transferring information from flock to flock and even across species. A researcher at the University of Oxford, Aplin studies the social nature of those big tit flocks at Wytham Woods. To investigate the birds' social networks and associations, Aplin and her colleagues fitted the tits with tiny electronic tags that track their visits to a grid of feeding stations. At the same time, the team evaluated each individual bird's personality with a test that measured their boldness and exploratory behavior. It should be noted here that birds do have personalities. Some scientists shy away from the term, with its anthropogenic overtones, preferring temperament, coping style, behavioral syndrome. But call it what you will, individual birds behave in ways that are stable and consistent across time and in different circumstances, just as we do. There are the bold and the meek, the curious and the cautious, the calm and the nervous, the fast learners and the slow learners. The variation in personality is thought to reflect a difference between individuals in their response to risk, explains Aplin. Scientists recently identified such personality differences in the chickadee, which helps to explain the diverse behaviors around our freshly filled bird feeder, the one apparently tyrannical little individual that is so adept at hogging all the seed, while another skulks timidly along the sidelines. Some chickadees are bold, fast explorers, slapdash and reckless, while others are slow, cautious and thorough. We take for granted the range of personality differences in our own species. Why shouldn't such variety exist in others? The study by Aplin's team not only revealed affiliations between birds with similar personalities. It also found that bolder birds flit between groups, expanding the size of their social networks and enhancing their access to information about food sources. This is especially important in winter, when finding a new good feeding patch might mean the difference between life and death, says Aplin. However, this behavior may also be a socially risky strategy, increasing the bird's exposure to predation and disease, which may help to explain why shyness as a trait persists in these birds. The team also found that different species of tits, great, blue, and marsh, share news of food with one another. The marsh tits are the best information providers, observes Aplin. They act as a kind of a keystone species in the information landscape. In Sweden and Finland, research revealed that one species may learn from another about not just food but what constitutes good real estate. The experimenters marked nesting boxes with white circles or triangles in an area where tits and migrant flycatchers both nest. Female flycatchers arriving late in the nesting season seem to cut their risks by choosing to nest only in boxes with the same symbols as those adorning boxes already anointed as choice nesting sites by tits. In other words, social birds can exploit information offered by other birds. This includes parents and peers and even other bird species. Scientists believe that the pressure to exploit these social sources of information have not only given some birds an advantage in the struggle to survive and reproduce, but may also have helped to drive the evolution of their relatively large brains. Birds turn out to be very good indeed at learning from their comrades. Think back to those famous British tits that learned how to open milk bottles in the early 20th century, a trick one bird learned from the next until, by the 1950s, milk bottles all over England were under siege. To see how this social learning might work, Aplin and her colleagues recently devised an ingenious experiment. They planted new behaviors in the great tit populations at Wytham Woods and watched how they spread. The team brought a few birds into captivity and trained them to solve a simple foraging puzzle. The birds had to push a sliding door either left or right to gain access to a feeder hidden behind the door. Some birds were trained to push the door to the right, others, to the left. Then all the birds were released back into their woods, which had been seeded with these foraging puzzles. The puzzles were outfitted with specially designed antennae to detect the tiny electronic tags worn by the tits, so that they logged information about visits from every individual bird. The results were remarkable. The trained birds remained faithful to the side they had been trained on, and within days the researchers saw the same behavior taken up by local birds in each area, with a rapid spread through social network ties to most of the local population. Even if a bird discovered it could push the other side to get the same reward, it stuck with the local tradition. And birds that moved into a new part of the woods from an area with a different bias switched their technique to match the local way of doing things. Birds, like humans, seem to be conformists. A year later, birds remembered their preferred technique, says Aplin, and the bias still held, even when the behavior spread to a new generation of birds. This kind of social learning, copying fellow birds in a local environment, say the researchers, might be a quick and cheap way of acquiring successful new behaviors without undertaking potentially risky trial-and-error learning. It is also, says Neeltje Boogert, the first experimental evidence of persistent cultural variation in new feeding techniques, once thought only to exist among primates. Social learning clearly plays a major role in the lives of birds, and not only in the food domain. Female zebra finches learn about mate choice from other females. Say a virgin female sees another female mating with a male wearing a white leg band. Later, when she is presented with two banded but unfamiliar males, one wearing a white band, the other an orange one, she will pick the guy in white. Then there's the matter of learning to recognize predators or threats. You would think that responding to a predator, such as a raptor or a snake, might be hardwired into a bird. Indeed, some responses are innate. But in spotting novel dangers, copying your confederates comes in handy. One experiment showed that European blackbirds learn to mob a species of bird usually considered innocuous, the Australian honeyeater, after they witness other blackbirds mobbing it. Birds learn about brood parasites in similar fashion. Young superb fairy wrens, for instance, are initially uninterested in the presence of a bronze cuckoo. But after they watch other fairy wrens harassing the cuckoos, they change their tune when they see one themselves, emitting whining and alarm calls that instigate mobbing and setting upon the cuckoos. A brilliant string of studies over the past 5 years by John Marslove and his colleagues at the University of Washington have revealed the extraordinary abilities of American crows not just to recognize individual humans by their faces, but to pass along to other crows information about those whom they deem dangerous. In one experiment, teams of people wandered through several Seattle neighborhoods, including the University of Washington campus, wearing different sorts of masks. One type of mask in each group of people represented the dangerous mask. The people wearing the dangerous mask captured several wild crows. The other people, sporting neutral masks or no masks at all, just meandered along harmlessly. 9 years later, the masked scientists returned to the scene of the crime. The crows in these neighborhoods, including those that weren't even hatched at the time of the capture, reacted to the people with the dangerous masks as if they were a threat, dive-bombing, scolding, and mobbing them. Apparently, the birds that witnessed the original capture and those that participated in later mobbings remembered which masks represented danger, and demonstrated this to other crows, including their young. This tendency to mob the dangerous mask spread to crows a half-mile or so from the original neighborhood areas, perhaps by way of crow information networks. Learning by observing or imitating is one thing. Learning under the tutelage of a teacher is quite another. More than 200 years ago, Immanuel Kant argued that a man is the only being who needs education. This view, that teaching is a uniquely human form of social learning, has held on stubbornly. Today skeptics still question whether teaching exists anywhere in the animal kingdom apart from Homo. True teaching, the thinking goes, requires all kinds of cognitive abilities that other animals simply don't possess, such as foresight and intentionality, as well as understanding that another being is naive and other aspects of theory of mind. But growing evidence suggests that some non-human animals do in fact show forms of teaching. Meerkats, for instance, seem to instruct their pups in handling tricky prey, such as snakes or scorpions. Adult meerkats offer the youngest, most inexperienced pups dead or disabled prey. But as the pups grow older, their instructors gradually introduce more and more challenging live prey. Giving a naive pup a wriggling scorpion or a snake that might slither away means that both teacher and pupil may well lose out on a meal. But the effort eventually results in a pup developing skillful hunting and handling of difficult prey. Even ants apparently teach. Scientists have observed experienced tandem-running ants modifying their journeys when trailed by a naive follower, pausing en route to let a follower pupil explore landmarks and resuming the journey only when the follower taps them with an antenna. Still, convincing examples of animal teaching are rare, which is one reason the apparent pedagogy of the pied babbler is so intriguing. The southern pied babbler is a striking white bird with dark chocolate flight and tail feathers that thrives in the scrub and savanna of southern Africa. The babblers live in small close-knit family groups of 5 to 15 and are highly social and garrulous. Known in Afrikaans as the white cat laughers, they are a noisy lot, named for their constant chattering and group choruses of chuck-chuck or chow-chow-chow. They never stray far from one another, but forage, preen, play fight, and huddle together. When one babbler flies, so go the others. Amanda Ridley, the principal investigator of the Pied Babbler Research Project, studies the birds in the southern Kalahari Desert of South Africa. Babblers are cooperative breeders. Family groups are dominated by a single breeding pair, along with several other adults that don't get to breed, but that nevertheless help to feed and care for the young. The dominant pair is monogamous not only socially but sexually, too, a rare thing in the bird world. In any group, 95% of the chicks belong to this pair. Still, all the adults in the group dote on the young, helping to brood, feed, and care for them. If the breeding pair does not produce offspring, babblers have been known to kidnap a young fledgling from another group and raise it as their own. Babblers spend around 95% of their waking time rummaging in the leaf litter for beetles, termites, insect larvae, and burrowing skinks. Foraging with your back to the world is a risky thing for a babbler. Up the food chain and on the prowl for bug. Probing birds are the African wildcat and the slender mongoose, the Cape cobra and the puff adder, the spotted eagle owl and the pale chanting goshawk. So dangerous is it for a babbler to have its head down that the birds take turns acting as sentinels, foregoing their own foraging to keep a lookout on behalf of the group for trouble arriving by land or by sky. The sentinel perches in an open spot above the foragers and actively scans for predators, sending up harsh, repetitive peeping alarm calls whenever necessary and offering the group continuous news on its monitoring in the form of a watchman's song. Other bird species take clever advantage of the babbler's elaborate sentinel system. Small solitary birds called scimitarbills are known to eavesdrop on the babbler's watchman. These little, public information parasites hang around the babblers when they forage, listening in on their alarm calls. This allows the lone scimitarbills to be less vigilant themselves, spending more time foraging in more places, with more success, and even venturing out into the open without worrying about predators. Fork-tailed drongos are more uncouth in their mooching. Highly intelligent, accomplished mimics, they sound false alarm calls of babblers and other species, which make the babblers drop their mealworms and run for cover. Drongos then steal in to seize the dropped food even if it's abandoned only for an instant, right beside the unwitting victim. Ridley and her team recently found that drongos fool the babblers by varying the type of alarm calls they produce, making it harder for the babblers to detect the deception. Being a sentinel babbler is a dodgy job. They get picked off much more often than foragers, especially by hawks and owls. But life can be dicey for all babblers. Here's where the teaching comes in. Ridley and her colleague Nicola Raihani have found that a few days before young babblers fledge, adults begin to emit a soft purr call when they bring food to the nest, accompanied by a gentle wing flutter. This is the training period. Purr call means food. The adults start to use the call only as the young approach fledgling age. As the young come to associate the call with food, the adult can then beta them by making a call when holding a food item, but not actually feeding it to them until they have successfully responded to the call, says Ridley. The young try to reach for it, but the adult moves back out of reach, away from the nest, forcing the nestling to follow. This evading tactic appears to be a way that parents can force a young to fledge, urgent business, as the chance of nest predation increases as the chicks get older. After a chick fledges, adults use the special call to move it away from danger and toward good foraging patches. This is more complicated than it sounds. Adults are not teaching their chicks a simple fact, such as the specific location of a foraging site. This would be somewhat useless, as most babbler foraging patches are ephemeral. Rather, they're instructing fledglings in the skill of determining the traits of a fine foraging patch, packed with prey, far from predators. They're also teaching the young how to respond appropriately to a threat by moving them away from unsafe areas when a predator is around, says Ridley. So the call serves two purposes post-fledging: learning about good foraging patches and learning how to effectively evade predators. Fledglings, for their part, are not passive pupils. The studies by Ridley and her colleagues suggest that the young birds use at least two clever social strategies to boost the amount of food they get. First, they're picky about whom they follow, choosing to tag along with adults who are especially proficient at capturing prey. Second, when they're hungry, they blackmail adults into feeding them at higher rates by venturing into riskier open locations. When they're satiated, they stay in the cover and relative safety of trees. It remains an open question whether the teaching shown by pied babblers requires sophisticated cognitive abilities. It may be governed by simple processes, such as the more reflexive responses that appear to be part of meerkat teaching. Meerkats may teach their pups by instinctively responding to changes in the pup's begging calls as they grow older. A young pup's call means bring dead prey, an older pup's call, bring live prey. But as Ridley points out, teaching pied babblers and teaching in meerkats is different. Meerkats tend to exhibit opportunity teaching, while pied babblers tend to display coaching, she explains. We can't rule out entirely that the teaching we see in babblers is the result of reflexive responses. More research is necessary, but it certainly seems like some cognitive abilities are required to carry out this type of coaching behavior. Ridley suspects that teaching may occur in other bird species with mobile young who accompany foraging adults and use cues from them to find food, such as Arabian babblers, white-winged choughs, Florida scrub jays, and white-browed scrub wrens. A number of my colleagues have noticed this behavior in the species they study, she says, so this type of teaching may be more widespread than we currently realize. Scientists have found this sort of surprising social ingenuity in the lives of many bird species. What they haven't found is something they expected: a correlation between a bird's social group size and its brain size. The social intelligence hypothesis predicts that animals living in big social groups will have larger than expected brains, because of complicated social pressures. Indeed, when Oxford anthropologist and evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar compared brain sizes in different species of primates, he found that those living in larger social groups had bigger brains. In monkeys and apes, the brain size of a species increased in lockstep with the size of the species group. In primates, group size is considered a proxy for social complexity, which may lead to more advanced cognition. A clever computer simulation recently offered some virtual evidence for this line of thought. Scientists at Trinity College in Dublin created a computer model with artificial neural networks that served as mini-brains. These mini-brains could reproduce. They could also evolve, with random mutations introducing new bits and pieces into their little networks. If these new pieces benefited the network, it would grow in intelligence and could reproduce again, passing along a little goose in brain power. When the scientists programmed the mini-brains to steer through challenging tasks that required cooperation, the mini-brains learned to work together. As these mini-brains got smarter, cooperation began to accelerate, along with the evolutionary pressure for larger brains. The findings support the idea that complex social interactions, like cooperation, provided the selection pressures necessary for the evolution of bigger brains and advanced cognitive abilities in our primate ancestors. However, when Dunbar and his colleagues looked at birds and other animals, the bigger social group equals bigger brain pattern didn't hold. The birds with the biggest brains didn't live in large flocks. On the contrary, they favored small cohesive groups and lived mostly in lifelong pairs. For birds, it seems, the quality of relationships, not the quantity, calls for additional brain power. The mental challenge is not remembering the individual characteristics of hundreds of individuals in large flocks, or roosts, or managing a large number of casual relationships. The really demanding task, at least from a psychological and cognitive point of view, is forming close alliances, especially forging bonds with a mate and providing long-term parental care to young. It's similar for many birds. About 80% of bird species live in socially monogamous pairs, that is, they stay with the same partner for a single breeding season or longer. This is largely because the business of feeding nestlings is so taxing, requiring biparental care. Birds with altricial young, especially, work their tail feathers off to feed them. Without the contributions of both male and female, few altricial offspring would make it to the fledgling stage. It makes sense to share the burden. But doing so, jointly incubating eggs and feeding and protecting the young, requires careful coordination and synchronization of activities. And that means being tuned into a mate's little quirks, wants, and needs, and day-to-day shifts in behavior. According to cognitive biologist Nathan Emery, being bound up with one partner in this way requires a special form of cognition. Called relationship intelligence, it's the ability to read a partner's subtle social signals, respond appropriately, and use this information to predict his or her behavior. And it takes considerable mental acumen. Some birds reinforce their bonds through fancy acts of coordinated body movements or vocalizations. Rook pairs, for instance, join in a tightly synchronized display of bowing and tail fanning. Plain-tailed wrens, shy, drab little birds living deep in the cloud forests of the Andes, sing rapidly alternating syllables so perfectly coordinated that it sounds like a single bird singing alone. Their duets are a kind of sophisticated auditory tango, demonstrating a truly astonishing level of cooperative behavior. The birds in a pair can sing alone, but when they do, they leave longer gaps between song syllables, in which their partner normally interjects a brief note. This suggests that each member of a pair knows its part in the song, but also relies on auditory cues from its partner to determine when and how to sing. It's a lot like the give and take of conversation. Performing duets with such high coordination requires being closely tuned in to your mate, and thus may communicate the strength of the pair bond and level of commitment to each other. A male budgerigar shows his commitment to his mate by drumming up a perfect imitation of her contact call, the special call she uses to keep in touch with her partner as she flies, feeds, and otherwise goes about her day. These small sociable Australian parrots are monogamous but also very gregarious. They like to hang out in large flocks. After only a few days together, pair-bonded budgerigars can converge on the same contact call, with the male managing a bona fide imitation of the female. Her call becomes his. The female uses the accuracy of his imitation to judge his commitment to courting her and his suitability as a mate. Nancy Burley of the University of California, Irvine, and her colleagues who study the budgerigar suspect that this may be the evolutionary reason for the ability of parrots to parrot, to quickly learn and mimic new sounds. It could also explain why parrot enthusiasts suggest that the best talkers among pet budgerigars are typically males that were obtained when very young and kept in isolation from other budgerigars, write the scientists. Budgerigars raised under these conditions probably become imprinted on humans and may begin to court them. What's actually going on in a bird's brain when it's being sociable? Why do some birds form powerful pair bonds and not others? And why are some kinds of birds loners and others social butterflies? The late James Goodson looked deep into the brains of birds to try to answer these questions. A biologist at Indiana University until his untimely death from cancer in 2014, Goodson studied the neural circuitry of social grouping in birds. He was interested in understanding the brain mechanisms that determine how birds make social decisions about whom to hang out with, and in what size flock. According to Goodson, the circuits in the brains of birds that control social behavior are much like the circuits in our own brains. The circuits are old, so old they are common to all vertebrates, dating back something like 450 million years, to the common ancestor of birds, mammals, and sharks. The neurons that form them respond to a group of evolutionarily ancient molecules called nonopeptides. The original role of these molecules was to regulate egg-laying in our ancient bilaterally symmetrical ancestors, but other social functions have evolved from this. In birds, Goodson found that differences in social behavior are rooted in subtle variations in the expression of the genes for these molecules. The same is likely true for humans, too. In our brains, the nonopeptides are known as oxytocin and vasopressin. Oxytocin, which is made in the hypothalamus of the brain, has been dubbed the love chemical, the cuddle or trust hormone, and even the moral molecule. In mammals, it plays a key role in giving birth, lactating, and maternal bonding. In the early 1990s, neuroendocrinologist Sue Carter added pair bonding to oxytocin's résumé. She and others discovered that prairie voles, which pair for life, have higher levels of the molecule compared with other vole species that are promiscuous. New research shows that food sharing in chimps raises oxytocin levels more than grooming does. This is evidence, perhaps, for the truth of the maxim, the way to your lover's heart is through her stomach. In humans, oxytocin has been shown to reduce anxiety and promote trust, empathy, and sensitivity. Recent studies have suggested, for instance, that a dose of oxytocin administered through the nose boosts the cooperation of sports team members and makes people more generous and trusting in role-playing games. It also may contribute to the strength of romantic bonds for men by enhancing their brain's reward response to the attractiveness of their partner compared with other women. Birds have their own versions of these neurohormones, called mesotocin and vasotocin. Over the past several years, Goodson and his colleague Marcy Kingsbury and their team have explored the action of these peptides in various species of birds that differ in their group size. Consider the zebra finch, a small, gregarious songbird that normally cozies up to its mate and mingles in flocks of hundreds. The biologists discovered that if they blocked the action of mesotocin in their brains, the birds spent less time with their partners and familiar cage mates and avoided big groups. On the other hand, birds that were given mesotocin instead of the blocker became more sociable and sought more close contact with their partners and cage mates, and with larger groups. Goodson decided to map the receptors for these peptides in the brains of bird species with different group size preferences. Maybe the density and distribution of the receptors were the key to why some bird species were more sociable than others. He focused on the astrilidids, a large family of 132 finches, waxbills, and munias. All of these birds have similar ecological lifestyles and mating behaviors. They're monogamous, mate for life, and care for their young together. However, they vary widely in the group sizes they prefer. Goodson trekked as far as South Africa to collect 3 species of astrilidids, 2 that were reclusive, hanging out only in pairs, the Melba finch and the violet-eared waxbill, and one that was moderately asocial, the Angolan blue waxbill. To round out the medley, he added 2 highly gregarious birds that breed in large colonies, the zebra finch and the spice finch, a handsome chestnut bird from tropical Asia that prefers the company of thousands. Enough, he found startling differences. The highly social, flocking zebra finches and spice finches had far more mesotocin receptors in the dorsolateral septum, a key part of the brain involved in social behavior, than did their more solitary relatives. Curious about whether the oxytocin-like peptides also played a major part in the pair bonding of birds, Goodson and his colleague James Klatt once again peered into the brains of zebra finches. You can tell that a zebra finch pair has bonded when the 2 birds clump, or perch side by side, follow each other, preen each other, and sit together in their nest. When the scientists blocked the action of the peptides in the zebra finch brain, they found that the birds did not display this normal pair bonding activity. Only with the peptides active in their brains, apparently, will the birds properly partner up. Some research suggests that oxytocin may play a similar role in humans. In one study, psychologist Ruth Feldman of Bar-Ilan University in Israel found that levels of the hormone in humans are correlated with the longevity of relationships. Couples with more oxytocin have longer-lasting relationships. However, as Marcy Kingsbury points out, the view of oxytocin in humans and its equivalent in birds as a simple cuddle molecule is evolving. Recent studies in finches suggest that the so-called love hormones can actually mediate aggression and even impair pair bonding, says Kingsbury, depending on the situation. Whether that applies to humans, too, remains to be determined, but in the view of Kingsbury and her colleagues, it seems likely given the similarities in the anatomy and function of these hormones across vertebrate classes. Indeed, some studies of human couples show the opposite of what you might expect: correlations between oxytocin and negative emotions such as anxiety and distrust. Kingsbury and others argue that there are no neurochemicals that have exclusively good or prosocial effects on the brain and body. When it comes to the social effects of these hormones, it seems, context and individual differences matter in both birds and humans. In any case, even paired birds with their cuddle hormones up and running are not paragons of fidelity. According to Rhiannon West, a biologist at the University of New Mexico, this may be another reason why some bird species are smart. West proposes that it's not just the challenges of maintaining pair bonds in birds that have boosted their brain power. Rather, she says, it's the complexity of achieving a successful pair bond and extra-pair copulations that is simultaneously driving the increase. It's what she calls an intersexual arms race. A few decades ago, science considered birds the very models of sexual monogamy. In the Nora Ephron film Heartburn, the female lead bemoans her husband's philandering, and her father responds, "You want monogamy? Marry a swan." But thanks to years of field observations and the advent of molecular fingerprinting, we now know that swans aren't sexually exclusive and neither are most other birds. DNA analysis has revealed that extra-pair copulations occur in about 90% of bird species. In any given nest, up to 70% of chicks are not sired by the male caring for them. Pair-bonded birds may be socially monogamous, but they're rarely sexually monogamous. If West is right, this, too, may be a driving force in the evolution of enhanced brain power. Take the Eurasian skylark, an old-world lark that lives in open grasslands, marshes, and heathlands across Europe and Asia and is noted for singing extraordinarily long and complex songs of up to 700 different syllables on the wing. Skylarks are generally socially monogamous. Though the male doesn't help build the nest or incubate the eggs, he does contribute up to half of the food for the nestlings and even more after the chicks have fledged. However, scientists found that 20% of the offspring in skylark nests were not genetically related to the male bird attending the nest. It's easy to see how males would benefit from promiscuity. More liaisons mean more offspring. But what about females? If a male's share of paternity became too low, he might withdraw his parental care. Why would females risk that? There's no shortage of theories. The going notion is that a female copulates with other males to increase the genetic diversity of the brood, or, perhaps, to garner better genes than those furnished by her partner. Behavioral ecologist Judy Stamps has offered another hypothesis for why females seek outside liaisons. Her repairing hypothesis, a kind of divorce remarriage scenario, suggests that trysting females may be checking out the home territory and parenting skills of other males. If a well-heeled male loses or drops his partner and seeks to replace his old mate, he might well turn to this now familiar up-and-coming female. By trysting with the male, the female not only secures a first-in-line position with him but gleans information about his potential as a superior parent or partner and the quality of his real estate. A new theory offered by two biologists from the University of Norway suggests that philandering females are encouraging better cooperation in the whole neighborhood. Females benefit because extra-pair paternity incentivizes males to shift focus from a single brood towards the entire neighborhood, as they are likely to have offspring there. This might have several positive effects, the researchers suggest, including less territorial aggression and better group protection from predators. In essence, by not putting all their eggs in one basket, so to speak, females are pumping up the public good, encouraging safer and more productive neighborhoods. Where maternity certainty makes females care for offspring at home, paternity uncertainty and a potential for offspring in several broods make males invest in communal benefits and public goods, say the Norwegian scientists. In other words, what's good for the goose is good for all the local geese and ganders. As evolutionary biologist Nancy Burley points out, it's unlikely that there's any unitary explanation for extra-pair paternity. The reason that female birds engage in extra-pair copulations probably varies greatly among species, she says. And within a species, the decision must reflect individual circumstances. In any case, it's clear that both male and female birds stray. But both also work hard to maintain a bond with their social partner to raise their young. In Rhiannon West's view, this dual life may be a key to the large brain size of socially monogamous birds. Regularly procuring extra-pair copulations while maintaining a social partnership makes for a complex social life, and, in West's view, an intersexual cognitive arms race. Think of it. A male faces the neurological demands of sneaking off to copulate with other females while still actively guarding his mate, to minimize cuckoldry. To reduce the chances of an intruder winging in for an extra-pair copulation, for instance, a male skylark must guard the nest closely before his mate lays her eggs. However, he also has another vital job, protecting his territory. So even when he's guarding his mate, he continues to perform the astonishing aerial song flights that serve as a territorial flag signaling, "This place is mine." These aerial displays of flapping, gliding, circling, and plunging can last many minutes and typically take place at altitudes of more than 600 feet. It takes some fancy maneuvering to guard both mate. The female, for her part, requires her own suite of cognitive capabilities, not just to sneak off for her own rendezvous but to assess potential partners for genes or real estate, not to mention sustaining the spatial memory to find her way back to her chosen mate. Indeed, in species with more extra-pair paternity, females have relatively larger brains than males. The reverse is true in species with less extra-pair paternity. The result of all this philandering in birds while at the same time tending to long-term pair bonds? A boost in brain size for both sexes. There may be another social arms race goosing bird intelligence. This one involves the pilfering of food, not sex. Jays again. This time, the western scrub jay, Aphelocoma californica. True to its common name, the saucy scrub jay is a commanding presence in the scrublands of the open west. It scopes out its territory in agile hops and bold lunges, pumping its tail and looking around with quick twists of the head. It misses little. Azure like its blue jay cousins, it is equally impudent, known as a thief, scoundrel, and jackal of the bush. According to one ornithologist, a favorite trick of the jay is to rob a cat of its food by giving its tail a vigorous peck and, when the cat turns to retaliate, to jump for the prize and make off with shrieks of exultation. The scrub jay lives in monogamous pairs throughout the year, often within flocks. But during the breeding season, each male bird acts as if he owns the place, staunchly defending his territory from rival scrub jays with darting flights and shrieking calls. The jay's ordinary alarm note is an astonishing vocal outbreak, dzweep, dzweep, with which the groves are brought up standing, writes one naturalist. It curdles the blood, as it is meant to do. Scrub jays are a caching species. All autumn long, they dart about the underbrush gathering acorns and other nuts by the thousands, as well as insects and worms. These they hoard for future use in thousands of caches throughout their territory. It all sounds very honorable and industrious, except for one thing. The birds live a kind of double life, storing their own food for future use while raiding the stores of other birds. They are cachers, all right, but they are also thieves who mine the hard-won booty of their neighbors. A scrub jay may lose up to 30% of his stash of stored food per day, no small thing for a bird that must squirrel away enough food to weather long, harsh winters. Pilferage, the loss of cached food items, is a big problem, plainly one of the drawbacks of social living. But there's an interesting twist. The interaction between food cachers and food thieves in the scrub jay community appears to have led to the evolution of some astonishingly smart behavior, tactical deception, on the part of both the food storer and the potential pilferer. In a series of inspired studies, Nicola Clayton and her colleagues have found that scrub jays will go to great lengths to protect information about the location of their caches from pilferers. A caching scrub jay will opt to hide his food behind a barrier or in the shade over a more obvious, well-lit place in the open, if and only if another bird is watching him. If the observer can hear him but not see him, he'll cache his food in a less noisy substrate, in quiet soil instead of pebbles. Moreover, if another bird has seen him hide his food in a particular cache, he may return to that spot and move, or pretend to move, the contents of that cache to another spot, in a kind of shell game that confuses the potential thief. He'll even pretend to cache by probing in a new place after the food has already been hidden elsewhere, confusing the pilferer so he can't keep track of where the food ends up. Is there a clearer example of sly trickery? Not just any observer will spur him to these elaborate tactical strategies. If his mate is watching, he's likely to be perfectly open in his actions. And only if a rival bird has watched him cache in a particular place is he seen as a threat. Somehow, scrub jays keep track of who has been watching, both where and when. They recall whether or not they were observed during a specific caching event and by whom, and will recache later only if absolutely necessary. But here's the really amazing thing. A scrub jay will think to do this, to resort to these clever cache protection tactics, only if he's had his own piratical experience. Birds that have never pilfered themselves hardly ever recache. In other words, say the researchers, it takes a thief to know a thief. Pilferers, for their part, try to keep a low profile, hiding while they watch a caching bird and keeping quiet, reducing the chances that the caching bird will think to use one of its cache protection schemes. The upshot is a kind of war of information, with pilfering jays developing strategies for actively seeking information while remaining unobserved, and cachers becoming more and more skilled at developing Machiavellian tactics for fending them off, concealing information, or providing false information. For Clayton and many others who study the scrub jay, the deceptive and manipulative behaviors of the bird suggest some highly sophisticated thought processes, memory for who was around when and where, as well as the ability to use the personal experience of being a thief to predict a thief's expected actions, and perhaps even perspective-taking, imagining another bird's point of view and tailoring reactions accordingly. The capacity to take the perspective of others, to grasp what might be going on in another creature's head, is one of the hallmarks of theory of mind. It's not clear whether caching and pilfering have driven the evolution of these cerebral skills. It could also be that the skills already existed in these jays, and they just applied them to caching. It's the proverbial chicken and egg situation, like the crow and its tools. Do birds experience such prized human social or emotional capacities as empathy or grief? It's a lingering question. As Clayton and her colleague Nathan Emery warn, for birds, especially those known to be smart such as crows and parrots, it is very easy to slip into the anthropomorphic trap and attribute them with human emotions without good evidence. But consider the case of the Greylag goose. A European bird of modest wit, the greylag was made famous by Nobel laureate Konrad Lorenz, who demonstrated that the young birds imprint on anything that moves. Case in point, the goslings he raised by hand followed, and then later tried to mate with, his Wellington boots. Greylag geese live in groups from small families to flocks of thousands and have a social life comparable to brainier birds such as crows and parrots. They show off their social bonds with partners and family members by sticking close and by performing together in a triumph ceremony, a series of ritualized movements and vocal display. A recent study at the Konrad Lorenz research station in Austria measured the heart rate of these geese, a concrete measure of distress, in response to various events, thunder, passing vehicles, the departing or landing of flocks, and, finally, social conflicts. The biggest boost in heart rate, it turned out, occurred not in response to something surprising or frightening, such as a clap of thunder or the roar of traffic, but in reaction to a social conflict involving either a partner or a family member. For the scientists, this points to emotional involvement, possibly even empathy. Then there is the kissing of rooks. These supremely social members of the crow family nest in crowded rookeries where there are lots of opportunities for tiffs. One study revealed that after watching a partner in a conflict, rooks often comfort the distressed bird within a minute or two by twining bills with it. This was heralded by researchers, albeit in somewhat cold potato terms, as a triumph of post-conflict third-party affiliation, meaning that after a fight, an uninvolved bystander offered this tender reassurance to the victim of aggression in the conflict, usually a mate. Only a few animal species have been known to reassure others in distress, among them great apes and dogs. Asian elephants were lately added to the list with a study showing that they may console a distraught individual with their trunks, gently touching its face or putting their trunk in its mouth, akin to an elephant hug. Not long ago, Thomas Bugnier and his colleague Orlith Fraser set out to discover whether ravens provide this kind of comfort to distressed mates or friends who are victims of a conflict. Do ravens feel sympathy for victims after an aggressive conflict? Do they console them? Consolation is of special interest, say the researchers, because it implies a cognitively demanding degree of empathy, known in humans as sympathetic concern. Consoling a victim means first recognizing suffering and then responding in a way that alleviates it for the sufferer. This requires sensitivity to the emotional needs of others, a trait once thought unique to humans and their closest relatives, chimps and bonobos. The scientists studied a group of 13 young ravens. Before young ravens pair up and get territorial, they hang out in large flocks and cultivate valuable allies and partnerships. In any social group, conflicts may arise, and an unkindness of young ravens is no exception. Raven fights, especially those within a family, are usually minor squabbles involving a few pecks here and there. But fights between strangers or members of other families over nests, mates, food, or territory can be prolonged and deadly. Over a 2-year period, the researchers carefully observed 152 fights among the young ravens, recording the identities of the aggressor, the victim, and the bystanders, flock members standing near enough to witness the conflict. They rated the fights as mild or intense. Then, for 10 minutes after each fight, they noted any acts of aggression or its opposite, affiliation, with the victims. To their surprise, the researchers found that within 2 minutes following an intense fight, bystanding flock members offered consoling gestures to the victim of a conflict. The gestures, offered most often by a partner or an ally, included sitting side by side with the victim, preening it, bill twining, or touching its body gently with the bill while uttering soft, low comfort sounds. The killjoy explanation: the birds may simply be trying to reduce the external signs of stress in their partner or ally. But to the study's authors, the raven's comforting behavior appears to arise from knowledge of the feelings of others. These findings, they write, are an important step towards understanding how ravens manage their social relationships and balance the costs of group living. Furthermore, they suggest that ravens may be responsive to the emotional needs of others. As for grief, when the news broke recently that scientists had witnessed a western scrub jay funeral, my mind went directly to an incident I witnessed years ago in a meadow not far from my home, a flock of blue jays gathering around a red-tailed hawk that had just picked off one of their own. The victim was flailing in the hawk's talons. The surrounding jays were squalling and mobbing the murderer, who seemed unperturbed by their commotion. I hung around for a while until the hawk finally flew off with its plunder, now limp. But this funeral was different. It was created by Teresa Iglesias and her colleagues at the University of California, Davis, who were interested in how scrub jays might respond to the presence of a fellow jay already dead. The team set out a dead jay in a spot in a residential neighborhood where the jays normally forage and recorded what happened next. The first jay to encounter the dead bird responded by calling in other jays with a blood-curdling alarm call. The jays nearby stopped foraging and flew to the site, joining in a loud, cacophonous gathering, which got bigger and noisier over time. Were they mourning a fallen member of the jay tribe? Jeering in outrage? Trading ideas about what killed him or how to get him out of this place? The birds congregated around the body for half an hour before they flew away. For a day or two thereafter, they avoided feeding in the area. Reactions to the study quickly cycled from wonder to a heated debate, and criticism of the researchers' inappropriate use of the F word, as one commentator put it. Some critics smelled straight-out anthropomorphism. This was hardly a funeral in the human sense. No, but the researchers weren't suggesting that. They were just demonstrating how birds respond to a dead member of their own species, apparently, by noisily telling other birds about the death and perhaps alerting the group to danger, a behavior the scientists called cacophonous aggregation. In this sense, perhaps the scrub jay gathering was more like the Irish wake that naturalist Laura Erickson recalled when she heard about this research. The wake was in honor of Erickson's father, a Chicago firefighter who died of a sudden heart attack immediately following a fire. Erickson describes how her father's fellow firefighters streamed in to see him one last time and talked about how good he looked except for being dead, or how they should spend more time in the gym or going on a diet of something, the subtext being that they wanted to avoid the same fate. In a follow-up study, Iglesias and her colleagues found that scrub jays respond with group cacophony when they see dead birds of different species that are about their own size, pigeons, for instance, or American robins or mockingbirds. The jays respond only weakly or not at all to the deaths of smaller species, such as finches. This suggests that these gatherings are used in assessing risk rather than for mourning, says Iglesias. Similarly sized birds tend to share predators. However, she adds, this does not preclude the possibility that Western scrub jays experience emotional pain during some if not all cacophonous gatherings. I'm not sure what to make of the scrub jay case. One definition of empathy is transforming another person's misfortune into one's own feeling of distress. Were those birds in the California experiment simply issuing a warning? Or were they feeling something on behalf of their comrade? Indignation? Fear? Sorrow? Birds may not express emotions through the facial musculature, as primates do. But they can do so using their heads and bodies or through vocalizations, gestures, and displays. Konrad Lorenz once noted that a Greylag goose that had lost its partner showed symptoms of grief similar to that of young children who have suffered loss. The eyes sink deep into their sockets. The individual has an overall drooping experience, literally letting the head hang. Mark Bekoff, professor emeritus at the University of Colorado, relates a story told by Vincent Hagel, former president of the Whidbey Audubon Society. While visiting at a friend's house, Hagel looked out the kitchen window and saw a dead crow just a few feet away. 12 other crows were hopping in a circle around the body, said Hagel. After a minute or two, one crow flew off for a few seconds, then returned with a small twig or piece of dried grass. It dropped the twig on the body, then flew away. Then, one by one, the other crows each left briefly, one at a time, and returned to drop grass or a twig on the body, then fly off until all were gone, and the body lay alone with twigs laying across it. The entire incident probably lasted 4 or 5 minutes. I've heard other stories like this, of hundreds of crows filling the trees around a golf course after a crow was killed by a golf ball, of a vortex of ravens assembling within minutes at the spot where 2 ravens roosting on a power transformer were electrocuted. In Gifts of the Crow, John Marsloff and Tony Angel suggest that crows and ravens routinely gather around their own dead. This response may be more social than emotional, they suggest, as the birds work out what the void means to their group hierarchy, matters of mates and territory, and also, as Iglesias suggests, how they might avoid ending up like their comrade. Marsloff has shown that when crows see a person holding a dead crow, the hippocampus in their brains is activated, indicating that they are learning about the danger. We are convinced that crows and ravens gather around their dead because it is important to their own survival that they learn the causes and consequences of another crow's death, write Marsloff and Angel. We also suspect that mates and relatives mourn their loss. I suspect so, too. Surely grief isn't a human invention any more than love, or deceit, or imagining what your mate might crave for dinner. 400 tongues. Vocal virtuosity. If you happen to find yourself at the foot of the stairs in the White House on a typical afternoon, sometime around 1804 or 1805, you might have noticed a perky bird in a pearl gray coat ascending the steps behind Thomas Jefferson, hop by hop, as the president retired to his chambers for a siesta. This was Dick. Although the president didn't dignify his pet mockingbird with one of the fancy Celtic or Gallic names he gave his horses and sheepdogs, Cuchulainn, Fingal, Bergera, still it was a favorite pet. I sincerely congratulate you on the arrival of the mockingbird, Jefferson wrote to his son-in-law, who had informed him of the advent of the first resident mockingbird. Learn all the children to venerate it as a superior being in the form of a bird. Dick may well have been one of the 2 mockingbirds Jefferson bought in 1803. These were pricier than most pet birds because their serenades included not only renditions of all the birds of the local woods, but also popular American, Scottish, and French songs. Not everyone would pick this bird for a friend. Wordsworth called him the Emery Mockingbird. Brash, yes. Saucy and animated. But merry? His most common call is a bruising tschak. A kind of unlovely avian expletive that one naturalist described as a cross between a snort of disgust and a hawking of phlegm. But Jefferson adored Dick for his uncommon intelligence, his musicality, and his remarkable ability to mimic. As the president's friend Margaret Bayard Smith wrote, whenever he was alone he opened the cage and let the bird fly about the room. After flitting for a while from one object to another, it would alight on his table and regale him with its sweetest notes, or perch on his shoulder and take its food from his lips. When the president napped, Dick would sit on his couch and serenade him with both bird and human tunes. Jefferson knew Dick was smart. He knew he could mimic other birds in his neighborhood, popular songs of the day, even the creak of the ship's timbers on a crossing to Paris. But what Jefferson could never imagine was how science would come to view the nature of Dick's ability. How rare and risky it is, the brain power it requires, and how it offers a window into a most mysterious and complex form of learning, imitation, the wellspring for so much of human language and culture. Inside the Lorfink Auditorium at Georgetown University one recent fall day, a flock of 180 specialists have gathered to bandy about new research and ideas about Dick's skill and its parallels with human language learning. The skill is the ability to imitate sounds, to glean acoustic information and use it for one's own vocal production, a vital prerequisite for language. It's called vocal learning, and it's rare in the animal world, thus far found only in parrots, hummingbirds, songbirds, the bellbirds, a few marine mammals, bats, and one primate, humans. The specialists are discussing the complex cognition involved in song learning in birds. If cognition is defined as the mechanisms by which a bird acquires, processes, stores, and uses information, then song learning is clearly a cognitive task. A young bird picks up information about how a song should sound by listening to tutors of its own species. It stores this information in its memory and then uses it to shape its own song. The scientists are noting the remarkable similarities of song learning in birds with human speech learning, from the process of imitating and practicing right down to the brain structures involved and the actions of specific genes. How songbirds have a speech defects, just as we do, and the way song learning in a bird literally crystallizes brain structure, teaching us about the neurological nature of our own learning. Johan Baljuis, a neurobiologist at Utrecht University, remarks on how strange it must seem to an outsider for scientists to be comparing birdsong with human speech and language. If we were looking for some kind of animal equivalent, wouldn't we look to our closest relatives, the great apes, he asks. But the odd thing is, so many aspects of human speech acquisition are similar to the way that songbirds acquire their songs. In the great apes, there's no equivalent at all. When I step outside the auditorium during a break, I notice a small cedar tree, more like a shrub, emanating a bouquet of birdsong. All around campus a cold northwest wind is shaking loose the leaves of oaks and maples and buffeting the occasional swoop of sparrows. Otherwise, there are few birds to be seen. But from the heart of this shrub I catch the tea-kettle, 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 tea-kettle of a Carolina wren and the gurgle of a white-breasted nuthatch. Then the brazen bullet-like pew-pew-pew-twee of a cardinal and what sounds like the scold of a robin. When I peer between the boughs, I see a single gray bird, feathers puffed against the chill. It's a northern mockingbird, one of Dick's tribe, spilling his soul in song. He pauses for a second or two between each set of phrases, as if mulling over his next selection. I've seen mockingbirds do this in the peak of spring to stake out their territory and call for mates, mounting to the highest branch to belt out their tunes. One April afternoon, I was at the foot of a solitary pine tree on the flat sandy landscape around the Delaware shore. Unlike the bird in the bush, this one cut a conspicuous figure. Perched erect on the topmost spray of pine, long tail briskly twerking, bill arrowed skyward, he poured out his music with fervor, throwing his whole body into the effort, song after song after song. The mockingbird is a member of the Mimidae family of thrushes found only in the Americas. On the voyage of the Beagle, Darwin met with mockingbirds everywhere in South America, where he noted, they are lively, inquisitive, active birds, possessing a song far superior to that of any other bird in the country. Mockingbirds have been maligned as mere thieves who pilfer tunes and miss the main musical point of their stolen songs. But to my ear, this Delaware bird sang Carolina Wren the way Bette Midler does the Andrews Sisters. It may be true that he was a shameless sampler, strewing about phrases from titmouse, chickadee, the sweet liquid song of a wood thrush, but he tucked them into his song the way Shostakovich weaves his symphony around a simple folk melody. After a while, I was lost, so captivated by his choral improvisation that I forgot to listen for familiar songs and calls. His melody filled the warm spring air with countless mimicked swells and trills, joyous and exuberant. Then, as abruptly as it started, his impassioned outburst ended. He fluttered down from the tree and settled quietly in the leaf litter, as if it just felt good to get the whole thing off his breast. That was in spring, when birds sing their hearts out to establish territory or secure a mate. But now it's mid-November, with a chilling wind. This bird is hiding in a cedar tree like a fugitive from justice, singing, it would seem, only to himself. His notes fall into little refrains repeated 4 or 5 times, and his songs seem limitless. How can a bird store so many tunes in a brain 1,000 times smaller than mine? And how did those tunes get there in the first place? Why is this bird apparently serenading himself deep inside a bush? It's not unlike our singing in the shower, hints Lauren Reiters of the University of Wisconsin, one of the birdsong specialists probing such questions in the warmth of the Lorfink Auditorium. This bird has spent enormous time and resources learning his oeuvre. Many people assume that bird songs are genetically encoded. But songbirds go through the same process of vocal learning that people do. They listen to adult exemplars, they experiment, and they practice, honing their skills like children learning a musical instrument. This is one reason those 180 songbird specialists have grown so deeply interested in their topic. Some of our most complicated skills, language, speech, music, we learn the way birds do, through a similar process of imitation. By studying vocal learning in birds, including those that can imitate human speech, such as parrots, says neurobiologist Eric Jarvis, we can find the essential brain pathways, genes, and behaviors that are necessary for this ability. All birds vocalize. They hoot, yodel, caw, wail, rattle, chit, seet, and sing like angels. They call to warn of predators and to identify family, friends, and foes. They sing to defend their territory, to stake it out or fence it in, and to woo a mate. Calls are typically short, simple, succinct, and innate, uttered by both sexes to make their point. Songs are generally longer, more complex, and learned, sung normally in tropical regions by both males and females, and in temperate climates more commonly by males only during the breeding season. But there is no neat division between call and song, and there are plenty of exceptions. The calls of crows fall into a dozen different categories: rallying, scolding, assembling, begging, announcing, duetting, among others, and some are learned. For sheer complexity, the calls of the black-capped chickadee far and away beat out a great tits two-tone song. But singing is something special. Nearly all animals that communicate vocally do it by instinct, says Jarvis, who studies vocal learning at Duke University. They are born knowing how to scream or cry or hoot. These utterances are innate or imprinted, like a sheep's baa. Vocal learning, on the other hand, involves the ability to hear a sound and then, by using muscles of your larynx or syrinx, to actually repeat that sound yourself, explains Jarvis, whether it be a sound learned in speech or the note of a bird song. Close to half the birds on the planet are songbirds, some 4,000 species, with songs ranging from the mumbled melancholy chortle of the bluebird to the 40-note aria of the cowbird, the long, Byzantine song of the sedge warbler, the flute-like tune of the hermit thrush. and the amazing seamless duets of male and female plain-tailed wren. Birds know where to sing and when. In the open, sound travels best a few feet or so above the vegetation, so birds sing from perches to reduce interference. Those singing on the forest floor use tonal sounds and lower frequencies than those singing in the canopy. Some use frequencies that avoid the noise from insects and traffic. Birds living near airports sing their dawn chorus earlier than normal to reduce overlap with the roar of airplanes. In his poem, Ode to Birdwatching, Pablo Neruda asks, "How out of its throat smaller than a finger can there fall the waters of its song?" It's a unique instrument called a syrinx, after the nymph transformed into a reed by Pan, god of fields, flocks, and fertility. Scientists took a long time figuring out its details because the syrinx is buried deep in a bird's chest, where the trachea splits in two to send air to the bronchi. Only in the past few years did researchers finally produce a stunning high-resolution three-dimensional image of the organ in action, using magnetic resonance imaging and microcomputed tomography. The high-tech image revealed a remarkable structure. It's made of delicate cartilage and two membranes that vibrate with airflow at superfast speeds, one on each side of the syrinx, to create two independent sources of sound. Gifted songbirds such as the mockingbird and canary can vibrate each of their two membranes independently, producing two different, harmonically unrelated notes at the same time, a low-frequency sound on the left, a high-frequency sound on the right, and shifting the volume and frequency of each with such breathtaking speed as to produce some of the most acoustically complex and varied vocal sounds in nature. All of this is managed by minute but powerful muscles. Certain songbirds, such as European starlings and zebra finches, can contract and relax these tiny vocal muscles with sub-millisecond precision, more than 100 times faster than the blink of a human eye. This feat of fast muscle contraction has shown up in only a handful of animals, including the sound-producing organ of rattlesnakes. The winter wren, a little brown bloom of a bird known for its swift song delivery, sings as many as 36 notes per second, far too quick for our ears or brain to perceive or absorb. Some birds can even manipulate the syrinx to mimic human speech. Birds with a more elaborate set of syringeal muscles tend to produce more elaborate songs. The mockingbird in that cedar tree has 7 pairs that allow him to perform his vocal gymnastics over and over, with seemingly little effort, 17, 18, 19 songs per minute when he really gets going. Between the notes, he takes tiny breaths to replenish his air supply. His phantasmagorical song may be executed by his syrinx, but it's initiated and coordinated by his brain. Nerve signals from an elaborate network of brain areas control each of the muscles, coordinating nerve impulses from his left and right brain hemispheres to the muscles in the two halves of his syrinx, creating just the right airflow in each necessary to produce the hundreds of different imitated phrases he sings. He makes it all look so easy. But think about it. To imitate a phrase, say, in German or Portuguese, you have to listen carefully to the person uttering it. You have to hear it accurately. Not such an easy task, Tim Gentner tells the roosting bird specialists at Georgetown, especially if you're at a cocktail party or on a noisy street where you have to pick it out from a cacophony of sound, a phenomenon called stream segregation. Birds put up with a lot of this party-like pandemonium, especially at peak times of song, like the dawn chorus. Many birds are social creatures, they're communicating with one another in relatively large groups, says Gentner, a psychologist at the University of California, San Diego. There's a lot of signal, and not all of it is useful to every individual at every point in time, so one important task is to figure out which acoustic streams are carrying information. Once you've segregated a target phrase from all that din, you have to hold it in your mind while your brain translates the sound into a set of motor commands. It sends these to your larynx in the hopes that it will produce a similar sound. Rarely do you get the phrase right the first time. It takes practice, trial and error, hearing your own mistakes and correcting them. If you want to retain the phrase, it means repeating it often enough to reinforce the brain pathways that created the memory in the first place. And if you want to remember it for life, you must file it away in a safe long-term storage place. Mockingbirds are really, really good at all this. The proof is in the sonograms or spectrograms. These are visual printouts of sound that scientists use to detect subtle differences in birdsong. Sonograms comparing a prototype song and the mockingbird's copy show that the imitator sings nuthatch and thrush and whippoorwill with almost perfect fidelity to the original script. Scientists found that when a mockingbird sings a cardinal's song, it actually mimics the muscular patterns of the cardinal. If the notes of his model fall outside his normal frequency range, he substitutes a note or omits it, lengthening other notes to match the song in duration. And if he's facing a too rapid-fire delivery of notes such as a canary's, he clusters the notes and pauses to breathe while still maintaining identical song length. That may not fool the whippoorwill or thrush, but it fools me. Of course, the mockingbird is not the only mimic in birddom. A cousin Mimi Day, the brown thrasher, by some accounts can mimic 10 times the number of songs a mockingbird sings, though not with such accuracy. Common European starlings are also accomplished mimics, as are nightingales, which can imitate some 60 different songs after hearing each only a few times. Marsh warblers are known to sing a wild, urgent, international pastiche of a song peppered with the tunes of more than 100 other species. Some of the songs are European, picked up at its nesting grounds, but most are African, plucked from the neighborhoods of Uganda, where it spends its winters. Its imitated songs of the Baran cisticola, vinaceous dove, and Brubershrike create a kind of acoustic map of its African travels. The lyrebird is renowned as a champion sound thief. As one naturalist noted, it's a startling experience to be walking in the Australian forest when suddenly you're confronted by a fowl-like, brown bird which may bark at you like a dog. The fork-tailed drongo, that brainy African bird that dupes the pied babbler, mimics the alarm calls of not just the babblers but a startling number of other species in a similar ploy to scare honest birds or mammals off their hard-won morsels, which the drongo then steals. There are reports of a bullfinch trained to sing "God Save the King," a gray catbird sounding taps, and a crested lark in southern Germany who learned to imitate the 4 whistling notes a shepherd used to work his herding dogs. So faithful were the imitations that the dogs instantly obeyed the bird's whistled commands, which included "run ahead," "fast," "halt," and a "come here." These whistled calls subsequently spread to other larks, creating a little pocket of local catchphrases. Some birds have an exceptional gift for imitating human speech. The African gray parrot is one such species. The myna certainly qualifies, as does the cockatoo. These few are generally considered the ciceros and churchills of birds. Arguably, there are a few others in the corvid and the parrot families, parakeets, for instance. The New Yorker once reported that, after weeks of silence, the first words uttered by a Westchester parakeet were, "Talk, damn you, talk." Imitating human sounds is a lot to ask of a bird. We form vowels and consonants with our lips and our tongue, among the strongest muscles per inch in the human body. For birds, with no lips and with tongues that generally aren't used for making sounds, it's a tall order to take on the nuances of human speech. This may explain why only a handful of species have accomplished the skill. Parrots are unusual in that they use their tongues while calling and can manipulate them to articulate vowel sounds. The African gray parrot is the parliamentarian of the bird world. Irene Pepperberg made African greys and their speech abilities famous through her work with Alex, perhaps the world's most renowned talking bird. Pepperberg would intermingle different sorts of questions about objects and Alex could answer with near-perfect specificity. For example, if she showed him a green wooden square, he could say what color it was, what shape, and, after touching it, what it was made of. He also could tone to phrases he heard around the lab, like, "Pay attention, calm down," and, "Bye, I'm gonna go eat dinner, I'll see you tomorrow." Alex was not alone in his badinage. One African grey I know, Throckmorton, pronounces his name with Shakespearean precision. Named for the man who served as an intermediary for Mary, Queen of Scots, Throckmorton has a wide repertoire of household sounds, including the voices of his family members, Karen and Bob, which he uses to his advantage. He calls out Karen's name in a Bob voice that Karen describes as spoton, she can't tell the difference. He also mimics the different rings of Karen's and Bob's cell phones. One of his favorite ploys is to summon Bob from the garage by imitating his cell phone ring. When Bob comes running, Throckmorton answers the call in Bob's voice. Hello. Uh-huh, uh-huh, uh-huh. Then he finishes with the flat ringtone of hanging up. Throckmorton imitates the glug sound of Karen drinking water and the slurping sound of Bob trying to cool his hot coffee while he sips it, as well as the bark of the family's former dog, a Jack Russell Terrier dead 9 years. He has also nailed the bark of the current family pet, a miniature schnauzer, and will join him in a chorus of barking, making my house sound like a kennel, says Karen. Again, he's pitch perfect. No one can tell it's a parrot barking and not a dog. Once, when Bob had a cold, Throckmorton added to his corpus the sounds of nose blowing, coughing, and sneezing. And another time, when Bob came home from a business trip with a terrible stomach bug, Throckmorton made sick to my stomach sounds for the next 6 months. For one long stretch, his preferred Bob word was sh-hi-height. Parrots have been known to teach other parrots to talk smack. Not long ago, a naturalist working at the Australian Museum's Search and Discover desk reportedly took a number of calls from people who had heard wild cockatoos swearing in the outback. The ornithologist at the museum speculated that the wild birds had learned from once domesticated cockatoos and other parrots that had escaped and survived long enough to join a flock and share words they had picked up in captivity, if true, a fine example of cultural transmission. Still, the sheer profusion and precision of a mockingbird's imitated songs is a marvel. A tally of one mockingbird's tunes captured 20 imitations of calls and songs per minute: nuthatches, kingfisher, northern cardinal, kestrel, even the high-pitched seep-seep-seep begging of a mockingbird chick. The Arnold Arboretum mocker of Boston was said to mimic 39 bird songs, 50 bird calls, and the notes of a frog and a cricket. You can tell where a mockingbird lives by the songs he sings. So particular is a song to its bird that individual birds within a population may share only 10% of their song patterns. When it came to describing the mockingbird's imitative skills, the ornithologist Edward Howe Forbush dropped all pretense of scientific detachment, trumpeting the mocker as the king of song, surpassing the whole feathered choir. No wonder the Native Americans of South Carolina called the bird sentient lately, or 400 tongues. It's only a small exaggeration. Mockingbirds regularly imitate as many as 200 different songs. Dan Beaker, an ornithologist friend of mine, notes that picking out the imitative songs a mockingbird sings becomes easier over the spring season. Early in the season their renditions are pathetic, muddled and difficult to identify, he says, but they get better as they go, as they hear and practice the songs around them: towhee, titmouse, truck backing up, or telephone. Why any creature would devote so much time and mental energy to imitating other species and random sounds remains a conundrum. Clearly the drongo's mimicry has a very specific purpose. But what about the mockingbird? The fancifully named bow jest hypothesis suggests that male songbirds flit from perch to perch and sing imitated songs after each move in an effort to make potential rivals think the region is packed with territorial males. The hypothesis is named for the Hollywood film starring Gary Cooper. In that film, Beau Jest bluffs attacking Arabs and protects his fort by propping up his wounded and dead comrades against the fort's parapets, and firing his rifle to suggest that every wall is manned with defenders. Some say vocal mimicry in birds is more like the Batesian version of mimicry. The monarch butterfly mimics the wing design of the toxic viceroy butterfly to warn would-be predators, "Eat me and you'll die." Australian magpies, for instance, mimic nest marauders like the barking owl and the boo-boo owl, perhaps confusing the owls about the identity of their prey. But this doesn't explain the magpie's mimicry of other sounds. Or the mockingbird's, which may have more to do with expanding his repertoire to please the ladies. Whatever the motivation, it's an astonishing feat. As early as 350 BC, Aristotle noted that songbirds learned to sing. Some small birds do not utter the same voice as their parents when they sing, if they are reared away from home and hear other birds singing. Darwin remarked on it, too. He knew that birds had an instinct to sing just as we have an instinct to speak, but they learn the songs themselves, just as we learn languages. He suspected that birds, like people, pass along their songs from generation to generation, forming regional dialects. But scientists of the 1920s, perhaps under the spell of B. F. Skinner, who thought that many behaviors even learned ones, were innately determined, decreed that the mockingbird was born with all his song. As ornithologist J. Paul Vischer wrote in the Wilson Bulletin, a mockingbird does not as a rule consciously mimic songs but only possesses an unusually large series of melodies, which it calls forth in wonderful perfection. To sort out the nature-nurture dilemma, ornithologist Amelia Lasky tried hand-raising a mockingbird in the late 1930s. One August morning she drove to a park 5 miles from her house, pulled a baby mockingbird out of a nest, and took him home to study. Honeychild was 9 days old. Like Jefferson's bird Dick, Honeychild would come to rule the roost until he died 15 years later. His first tentative notes came when he was almost 4 weeks old. He sang softly with closed beak for 10 minutes, wrote Lasky, a series of almost inarticulate warblings and whistles, utterly lacking in imitations of other species. Occasionally he ventured a very soft tone to whisper a song of his own, a raspy cheep or chirrup, an exquisite thing, soft, appealing, and infinitely tender in its cadences. By 4.5 months, Honeychild's songs were interspersed with the whistles, trills, warblings, and squawks of birds he could see or hear from his indoor home: downy woodpecker, Carolina wren, blue jay, northern cardinal, starling, bobwhite. During this first song season, household noises, particularly that of the vacuum cleaner, often started him singing. And as spring approached, his songs grew loud, varied, and long, beginning at 5:30 a.m. and continuing all day, like an aviary of. At 9 months, Honeychild ventured his first direct imitation, responding instantly to a tufted titmouse for the first time with a pedo song of his own. Eventually, he added to his repertoire dozens of birds, along with the squeak of the washing machine downstairs and the whistles of the mailman and Mr. Lasky calling the dog. Some songs he would sing for a while, then drop them from his repertoire, only to resurrect them again the following spring. One June day, a count during 16 minutes of lively singing yielded a list of 143 calls, or songs of at least 24 other species, an average of 9 per minute. We call this intricate process of vocal learning advanced or complex because it's done our way, through listening, imitating, and practicing. Lately, science has probed the deeper details of vocal learning in that obliging little bird from Australia, the zebra finch. Dolphins and whales are good vocal learners, too, but for obvious reasons, they don't make very good lab animals. The ideal model organism for studying any kind of learning is a rare beast, says biologist Chip Quinn. It should have no more than 3 genes, be able to play the cello or at least recite classical Greek, and learn these tasks with a nervous system containing only 10 large, differently colored, and therefore easily recognizable neurons. The zebra finch does not quite measure up, but it does make an excellent animal model for vocal learning. Named for the black and white stripes on their throats, zebra finches are easy to breed, mature rapidly, and are champion songsters, even in captivity. A young male zebra finch learns a single love song from his father or other males in his first 90 days after hatching, and faithfully repeats that song throughout life. Because it's impractical and unethical to monitor and manipulate the neurons implicated in vocal learning in humans, says Richard Mooney, a neuroscientist at Duke University. These songbird tutors and students provide a beautiful substitute system so that we can study the detailed brain mechanisms that underlie this relatively complex type of learning, from the stages in the process right down to the genes that flicker on and off while the bird is learning. A baby zebra finch starts his long journey to the full-throated music of mature song just as we do on our journey to speech. He listens. Incidentally, birds do have ears. Not our fleshy external pinna, just tiny holes beneath the feathers on either side of the head. The song a young bird hears sends sound waves into his ear and vibrates the hair cells there. These are 10 times as dense as ours, and much more varied, allowing birds to detect high-pitched sounds beyond our range, as well as the soft rustling of insects beneath soil or leaves. Sensory nerves in the brain stem pick up the signals from the hair cells and pass them along to auditory centers in the forebrain, where the neurons will form an auditory memory of the song. In the first 2 weeks of its life, the baby bird sits in his nest, listening closely to a tutor, usually his father. He's silent, soaking up the sounds around him as a baby does. The father sings, the young bird listens and begins to memorize. He doesn't try to imitate the song yet, he just forms a mental template, or picture, of it.